And it is that while the lethality of their power is greater than ever, their capacity to impose control over the politically awakened masses of the world is at a historical low. Namely, in earlier times, it was easier to control 1 million people. Literally, it was easier to control 1 million people than physically to kill 1 million people. Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people.
The smoke in the air of our Concord bridges and Pearl Harbors is always smelled first by the farmers who come from their simple homes to find the fire and fight.
If you embark on instituting a society where government protects you from yourself, you're in big trouble, and that's what they're doing. That's all government is force. I mean, do you have a choice about paying Medicare taxes? This government uses force to mold behavior or mold the economy. They've overstepped the bounds, and they violated the whole concept of our revolution and our Constitution.
Welcome, everybody, to the Friday edition of the Freedom Link here on the Orion Talk Radio Network. I'm Joe Joseph, along with my good friend Tim Watts. And tonight, folks, our special guest is Marilyn Barnewall. A little background on Marilyn. She's the president of the Magruder Agency, Inc., bank financial consulting and profit analysis from 79 to 93, recognized as the guru of North American private banking. And that was from Town and Country and Trust Estates magazine. In July 9th, 1989, issue of Forbes, Barnewall was hailed as the Dean of American Private Banking. She's an author. She's an investigative reporter. She's a jack of all trades, if you will, and I'm so very happy to have her on the broadcast tonight. Welcome, Marilyn.
Thank you very much. I feel like a jack of all trades. Wonderful selection of words.
Well, so last night we discussed Lee, and for all you that didn't join us last night, Ambassador Leo Wanta and the case of the missing $27.5 trillion, which I found out is now $30 trillion with interest.
That's true.
Yeah, and I mean, that's incredible. It's just one of those unfathomable amounts of money. And, let's get started since we've only got an hour, Marilyn. How did you get caught up in the Wanta mess, I guess you could say?
Caught up is a good term for it. Basically, I wrote a book. I had written 7 books that were published by the American Bankers Association and sold only within the banking industry. And when I became disabled in 93, I started writing non-banking books. And this one, second one actually, was called When the Swan's Neck Breaks. And I wrote a story about a guy whose life paralleled Lee Wanta's life. Never heard of Lee Wanta in my life. And it was so paralleled. My amount, I only had him with $13 trillion. And as a banker, that sounded like a horribly large amount of money to me. I have since become more inured to things like $16 trillion debts. But anyway, when the book came out in July of 1998, and about September of 98, somebody sent me an article about Leo Wanta. I call him Lee. He's got 2 names, by the way. His birth certificate name is Lee. His baptism certificate name is Leo. In the intelligence world, he's known as Leo. I know him as a friend. I call him Lee, but I'm referring to the same person, Leo Wanta. And anyway, 3 months after I read this, when I read the article, I almost had a heart attack because I thought this guy could sue me because there's so much of what I had created for this covert operator. He wasn't living in Vienna like Lee was, but he was living in Salzburg. I mean, it just, the whole book about him was so close that I thought, I was worried if he ever read the book, he'd sue me because he'd think that I had co-opted his life into a fiction novel, and that wasn't true. So about 3 months after that, in February of 2009, I got an email from a very good friend, C.J. Williams, who writes for her home newspapers in Michigan, but she also writes with me on News with Views and WorldNet Daily and so on. And she, at the end, you know how you scroll down to the end of an email?
Sure.
I scrolled down to the end of the email to make sure I'd read everything, and there, on a page all by itself, was an email address for Ambassador Lee E. Wanta. I called her immediately and said, "Where did you get this email address? Why are you sending it to me?" And she had no idea it was there.
Wow.
So I thought about it for a day or two, and I sent him an email. I sent Lee an email saying, I sort of duplicated your life in this book. I didn't know who you were. If you are this person, I would appreciate a response. And he responded and said, yeah, that was him. And so we started communicating. I sent him a copy of the book. And at that point, I had 21 chapters of the follow-up book written, Flight of the Black Swan. And as I sent it to him because William Leonard, who was my character that resembled Lee's life, became the hero in that book. And he read the book, and he called me, and he said, "How do you know so much about my life?" And I said, "What? I don't know anything about your life." He said, "Well, you know my favorite hotel in Chicago where I take my grandchildren for brunch." I said, because I had quoted Whitehall Hotel in Chicago, which is where I used to stay when I consulted for First of Chicago. And it just went on that, you know my favorite meal for lunch, and it just we went through all these things. So there was some kind of a fated connection there. I don't have any idea what it was, but we became very good friends, and that's how I got to know Lee.
Wow. That's an amazing amazing story. And so, of course, Ambassador Wanta did the majority of his work during the Reagan administration. How did Reagan come to select Lee for this position?
Well, you have to understand, Lee had been involved in intelligence work since he was 15 years old. When he was 15, he was working at the John Birch Society in Milwaukee. He was cleaning the offices and doing a whole lot of other things, handing out handbills and so on. And every night on the bus, he would get on a certain bus, and an FBI agent named Joe Kriofsky would meet him, and Lee would give him a green bag filled with the trash from the John Birch Society. So that was his start. And he basically, Senator Wiley from Wisconsin, heard Lee giving a speech one night with a youth group, and Lee had a very difficult stutter problem. And Senator Wiley worked with Lee's mom and got him involved with Dale Carnegie, and so he was involved with people at very high levels from a very young age. He has, people, one of the questions I get asked most often is this guy for real? There
Right.
are letters that I've made available at the Global News and Views website where the book is that we're doing. It's called Americans Want to Be Free.
Yeah.
And one of the links that I've made available have to do with a lot of the things we're going to talk about tonight. So, but among those things are letters from people like Senator Charles Grassley, like Lee's congressman, like Caspar Weinberger, like George Bush when he was before he became vice president, and so on, recommending Lee to. They came from a lot of different people, and a lot of this information, by the way, I got from the Reagan Library. A lot of people wonder, where did you get all this information? Are you just writing about information in this book that's been provided to you by Lee Wanta, and he can send you anything he wants? No, I did my own research. I'm an investigative reporter, was trained that way when I was young. And before I ever even agreed to talk with Lee, C.J. Williams and she can find anything in the world on the Internet. She's much better than I am. And she and I Lee doesn't even know this, I've never told him, researched him thoroughly before I even talked to him.
Wow.
So, anyway, when Reagan took office, he had a horribly difficult problem. He had the two conflicts that were there were, should he base his foreign policy on the ongoing wars that we kept fighting in Korea and North Vietnam, and Vietnam against the North Vietnamese, against the move of communism to expand? Or should we attack the Soviet currency that was funding those wars? And Reagan had, as you know, a tremendous respect for the United States military. Mm-hmm. Well, he had respect for everything that was America, God bless him.
Sure.
And he decided on the latter as his target, that in order to control and stop all these wars that were continually being promoted by the Communist Party in Russia, of the Soviet Union, that he would attack the currency. And Lee is a currency expert, and he also is a guy with a phenomenal memory. He's one of those people who goes back. He's got a photographic memory. And he had done work, with the security services. He knew Bill Colby, and presidential task force that Reagan put together to investigate how can he contain this growing need for the expansionary communist philosophy. He called in Bill Colby, who was the former director of the CIA, William Casey, who was going to be Reagan's director of the CIA, and Leo Wanta. And there were, as the presidential task force after Reagan was inaugurated grew, it grew to include William French Smith was part of it, by the way, part of that original group, his attorney general, Reagan's attorney general. And it grew to include military intelligence, CIA, and so on and so on. And that would have been 1981. And the plans were formatted, they were approved, but they were going to take time to implement. And one of the things that needed to happen was Executive Order 12333, which Reagan signed in December of 91, which gave intelligence operatives the right to, I don't know, I always say it wrong, that gave them the right to establish businesses while researching intelligence information on behalf of the United States government. And when you read in there the part, if you want to research it, that you should read, is about Title 18, Section 6. So, for example, Lee started a lot of companies, most of which were Title 18, Section 6 companies. In other words, they were established for the purpose of gathering intelligence data in foreign countries. Okay? So that's 12333 had to be signed. And the second thing that had to be done, they had to weaken or set up the Russian economy so that when Lee went in to bring down the ruble, that it was ripe for the picking. And that was done through Star Wars. that I don't know how many people are old enough to remember all of the questions that came up from Ronald Reagan. Yeah. I mean,
it was unbelievable.
Everybody objected how crazy this guy was. Well, one of the it was a good program in and of itself, but the primary reason for it was that Reagan and Casey and all these people knew that if the United States declared that it was establishing a program called Star Wars, SDI, to contain missiles and do all the things that Star Wars was supposed to do, that the Russians would follow. And they did, and they came very close to bankrupting themselves over SDI, which then made it very possible for Lee, when the time came, to go in, because at the time Lee went into the Soviet Union to bring down the ruble, their currency was, if it could get worse than ours is now, it was very close to that, but it was very close to going totally over the cliff. And so Reagan made Leo Wanta the trustee of $150 billion from the Department of Defense, which, by the way, Lee repaid within 6 months. That's how successful this program was.
Wow.
So he went in and he was buying rubles. Buying may not be the right word. He was...
Was he doing? Was it actual rubles, Marilyn, or was he buying debt instruments? I mean,
no. He was buying, at this point, he was buying rubles, Soviet rubles, and they were valued at that point at $1.20 each. Lee was able to get them for anywhere from 16 to 28 cents a ruble. And then they would be sent to a settlement bank in Singapore, for example, and the Russians would have to pay him $1.20 per ruble.
Wow.
So that's where the profits came from. But one of the most important things that he did, he literally changed the value of the ruble. He and Howie, his partner, Kakaoi Kwong, His Excellency Kakaoi Kwong, went to nations that were indebted to the Soviet Union and made rubles available to them for a very big discount, let's say. In other words, if you were Poland or if you were Iran and you owed money to the Soviet Union, you could buy rubles from New Republic, Lee's company in Title 18, Section 6 company in Austria. You could buy them from him for 50 cents, 40 cents. I don't know. Different countries got different amounts based on what they owed and what the value of their currency was. And so that's what he did. He gave them money to pay off their debt, and by having the debt come in being paid off at, say, 32 cents on the ruble, that literally lowered the value and was the thing that brought the Soviet ruble to ruin. And I think it needs to be added because, again, you get back to the argument of, well, that's really a rotten thing to do. Well, yeah, so is killing a lot of American kids in Vietnam and North Korea. Sorry about that, guys. This was the alternative. Live with it.
Right, exactly.
So this was a two-pronged attack then, Marilyn, to basically undermine the Soviet Union by going in with the Star Wars plan first and then sending Lee in with this plan later on, correct? And
that's correct.
The big money that we're talking about, folks, $27 trillion trillion with a T, $27 trillion. And this is the money that came out of this venture. Now, was all of this a part of the dissolution of the corporations? Or part of that $27 trillion come from his profit off the ruble?
Well, yeah, but when you get to the 4.5T that we're going to talk about later, but that's down the road. And all that money didn't come from Russia or from Soviet Union from the failure of the Soviet ruble. This came from Lee invested in a very interesting way. He invested in prime bank guarantees over a period of time. I want to make clear, though, something that the Russian Commission, if anybody wants to check this, by the way, in January 1991, there's a criminal case filed in Russia, number 18/5922-91. When it came out, it stunned everyone internationally that the Russian government had gotten in bed with a bunch of international con men to swipe all of the rubles in circulation in return for black market dollars. Well, Lee didn't go in there with a clean record. I mean, they manufactured a record for him that he probably would fall under that category if you were defining him from the perspective of the Soviet Union. But there was a covert multinational attack against the Soviet Union ruble, and it had been targeted from Poland, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Austria, Sweden, Switzerland, and so on. Lee he has great respect for the Russian people, and he made sure that he requested from the Russians an immediate line of credit of 140,000 rubles to invest in the new Russian economy when the ruble came down. And he's told me, he said, I brought everything from Tampax to frozen chickens into Russia. And we've talked often about it was the right thing to do for the people.
Wow, hold that thought, Marilyn, because we're up against a break. Folks, when we come back, we'll have more with Marilyn Barnewall and get in a little bit deeper into Leo Wanta and the case of the missing $27 trillion. Folks, don't go away. We'll be right back after these messages. Talk radio is growing fast, and it's all thanks to you. With over 1.2 million people listening, folks are now making Orion Talk Radio their choice for the truth. They know the corporate mainstream media machine has failed us miserably, so thank you to each and every one of you for listening to Orion Talk Radio, news and views beyond the mainstream media. Joe Joseph and Tim Watts here, along with our very special guest, Marilyn Barnewall. And, Tim, the floor is yours, my friend.
Well, I wanted to ask Marilyn real quick, because now, obviously, Leo is a financial genius, and Marilyn, you're somewhat of a financial genius on your own. You've got a lot of banking experience. You guys are obviously aware of the Inslaw Promise software, Michael Riconosciuto and all that back from the 80s. That was a huge deal back then. I'd like to know if any of that was possibly involved here, and also maybe as a follow-up question, Leo is under a gag order, but yet he's allowed to write his biography. How does that work?
Oh, he's not allowed to write the biography. I am, and okay. That was mostly my research work. I mean, I'm the one who's written to Switzerland and gotten the court transcripts and written to all of the various Wisconsin. I'm the one who's done the investigation. Lee's been very good about sending the documents he's able to send, and a lot of them are out there. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. You have to tell your audience why I'm coughing.
That's okay. Marilyn, he has a little issue with asthma here today, so get a break, grab some water there. But the other issue I wanted to ask about was the Inslaw Promise software. That was so big back then, and I know Leo had to have some knowledge of that.
Yeah, he not only had knowledge to it, I know he's had access to Promise in identifying some of the $23 trillion that was stolen by the Federal Reserve System, the Treasury Department, the Bush cabal, whatever you want to call it. But it was involved in the original theft. I mean, are you aware of the Inslaw lawsuit against the government?
Yes.
Okay, so that whole thing happened. Danny Casolaro was killed. All kinds of things happened. If people haven't looked into the history of the Promise software, that would be a program all by itself. And I'm not an expert on it, but people should look into that because, yes, indeed, it has been involved in all of this.
I find it interesting that you mentioned that Casey and Colby were both brought into play there, but somehow the guy in the rocking chair there in the middle, Bush wasn't tabbed to be involved, but yet somehow he becomes involved later on in this whole thing?
Well, he was in but see, one of the things that I found, and this was my discovery a couple of weeks ago, in fact, that I did not realize that Ken Starr was an assistant to William French Smith, and William French Smith was a part of this task force. Ken Starr also was an attorney for a very brief period of time for Lee Wanta, and when they brought him to Wisconsin on criminal charges.
Wow.
And there was a leak. We need to go back to that very quickly. But during that period of time of the task force, there was a leak, and there was they wanted to Al Capone him. They wanted to set up something so that when they wanted to take him down, Lee, that they would be able to take him down. And so suddenly all kinds of spurious, and I mean spurious, tax charges were filed against Lee over a company called Falls Vending. Now, it was, I think someone mentioned yesterday that Lee purchased Falls Vending. He did not. He never did. He never owned a share of that company. He was the president of the company, and he went there on an FBI sting that involved the Balistrieri crime family out of Milwaukee, Detroit, Chicago, and Las Vegas. And the sting was very successful. Not only was Balistrieri in prison, so were his two sons, who were attorneys at the time, working, I guess, for Daddy. I don't know. But that whole thing was a total scam. Everything that was filed against Lee Wanta in Wisconsin in the 1980s had nothing to do with Lee Wanta. It had to do with Falls Vending Service. And all those tax warrants that were filed against him were filed because he accepted from a guy named Joe Statmuller, I got a copy of the letter, from the Eastern District Bankruptcy Court of Wisconsin. When Falls Vending declared bankruptcy, he was named the receiver, or whatever the official title is, by the federal district court. In other words, Lee was paying all of the taxes, all of the debts of Falls Vending. One of the checks that came in that Lee sent to pay taxes to the state of Wisconsin, and I believe it was in the amount of like $460,000, was returned by the bankruptcy court to the participants in the bankruptcy and were applied against debt at F&M Bank, which was, and Lee complained about it. Not only complained, he filed whatever he needed to file and informed everybody. And suddenly, all these lawsuits about taxes, for taxes involving Falls Vending, and from suppliers like Dixie Cups and so on, were filed not against Falls Vending, but against Falls Vending and Leo E. Wanta as the owner of Falls Vending. He was never
he was never the owner. Right.
And in fact, if you look at all the three primary judicial decisions that I've included in the book, one is from the Administrative Law Court. That's Judge Joe Rebine. And she clearly stated Lee Wanta is not responsible for any of the taxes of Falls Vending. Judge Reynolds filed a judicial decision saying the same thing and very clearly stated that he had absolutely no ownership position whatsoever in Falls Vending. And Judge McGraw also in the circuit court. Now, Reynolds was federal district court, the bankruptcy court, and he said, this guy has no interest in this company. They can't just say he owes the money. He didn't. But that's what they set up. And so that all got sort of, they couldn't do anything with it because they really couldn't prove anything. But they had background of, okay, we have now filed tax charges against someone.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so 1992 comes, and George Bush comes to Singapore. He finds Lee Wanta and Howie Kok Kwang owning Anico Credit Private Limited, and he demands half of the asset base of the bank for payment.
Wow.
And it was said on another radio show the other day that Howie slapped George Bush and was dead the next day, and that's not true. Howie did use some choice words. I think I mentioned to you he used the word mother as an adjective, and Lee immediately got him out of the room, actually, for both of their protection. And Howie did die. He was murdered 2 weeks later with rat poison.
Wow.
And that was an incident where Lee had been set up, according to General Vernon Walters, had been set up the same night to be suicided or whatever, that he got the call from the hospital telling him that Howie was dying. And instead of doing what they expected him to do, which would have been to call for his limo and go to the hospital and go in the main hospital door, Lee went out another door, caught a cab, and the cabbie, who was a Singaporean, drove him to the emergency room entrance. And when he got to the room, the CIA guy that was in the room with Howie just absolutely, he didn't know what to say. Lee said, well, what are you doing here? And Lee said, well, you called me to come, that Howie was dying. But I know, but how did you get here? What happened? And at that point, Lee turned around, and Howie had just died. And Lee is a lay minister in the Catholic Church, and he baptized Howie, and then went back to the hotel and began writing letters to Dan Quayle to get him out of Singapore. And that's when they brought him from Singapore back to, he came through San Francisco, but never went through immigration and customs, was put on another airplane immediately, private plane, and flown into Canada, where he stayed at a safe house for a year.
Unbelievable. Hold that. Hey, Timmy, just hold that thought for a second. I want to put this out before we don't have another opportunity. The website, folks, if you want to read the biography. Now, this Marilyn's wrote a fantastic biography thus far. It's unfinished, but she's publishing it chapter by chapter for free on globalnewsandviews.com. Go there today, and you can download your own copy of this. Go ahead, Tim.
The Global News and Views.com.
The Global News and Views, right.
Yeah, you have to have the word in there, globalnewsandviews.com. Basically, I decided to publish the book this way, excuse me, because I am linking documents to the book to prove what's being said is true. That was the only way I could do it. You can't do that with print copy, and so that's why I'm doing it that way.
Okay, and I just want to clarify here for so people know who we're talking about. Of all the parasites and scourges that have crawled upon the face of the earth and been a blight upon humanity, we are talking about H.W. Bush and not W in that hotel room where Howie got mad, correct?
That's right. That's correct.
So I'm confused then. So how is it? So he's in H.W.'s face, but yet he's writing back to his vice president to get him out of there?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was Lee reported directly to the office of the president. You have to understand, he was stuck with that.
Interesting.
Good grief.
Yeah.
Okay, so Lee was set up with the Wisconsin tax charges. He spent a lot of time, 134 days in a Swiss jail, and that was an interesting thing because he gets out on a letter from Yitzhak Rabin?
Well, he went. He was directed to go to Switzerland to investigate a case called Chaselet, where banks in Switzerland were reactivating what should have been dead credit instruments like letters of credit and so on. And that's what he was investigating. And Wisconsin wired the Swiss Sûreté, and they lied, frankly, to federal investigators to get a fugitive flee warrant. And they didn't have it then, but they told the Swiss authorities that it would be on the way. And you have to bear in mind, the reason Lee was in Lausanne, Switzerland that morning was because he was to meet with Vince Foster that afternoon. And he was delivering to Vince Foster $250 million for the Children's Defense Fund, which is Hillary Clinton's favorite deposit source.
Yeah,
and,
choice of wording there.
Yeah, and so he was there to meet with Vince Foster on the 7th of July, and he had just had breakfast. He was also there with a warrant to arrest Mark Rich. William Sessions had given him a warrant. Now, bear in mind, Mark Rich is the last person that Bill Clinton pardoned before he left office. Mark Rich is one of the biggest money, if not the biggest money launderer in the world, and he lives in Zug, Switzerland, and is protected by the Swiss, by the way. So there Lee is. He's having breakfast. He was supposed to get Mark Rich on. Well, Mark Rich was supposed to be catching a ferry across the lake and go to a French casino. And one of the women that the Swiss government had, by the way, recommended to Lee that his company use Ameritrust Swiss Corporation that he had filed there, was Mossad, and he saw her on the balcony with Mark Rich, and Mark Rich, as a result, Lee thinks, of that conversation, did not get on that ferry to go so he could be arrested. And so the next morning, they had just finished breakfast, and Lee was paying the bill, in fact, for breakfast, and was arrested by the Swiss Sûreté. He was thrown in a Swiss dungeon, number 130, at Dubois prison, and he was kept there in solitary confinement for 134 days. He never saw the inside of a courtroom. No charges were ever filed against him. And on November 16th, a letter that had been coded by Yitzhak Rabin was received at the prison, and Lee did get the letter. I have a copy of the letter that is with the book. And the next day, the Swiss had him on an airplane back to New York.
Wow.
He, under gunpoint and in body chains. This for a man against whom they had not filed a single charge. And I have written to the Swiss and have gotten the tribunal hearing, court transcripts, and everything. They are shocking in their total non-relationship to anything called justice. So Lee goes into court in front of federal district court magistrate Aline Ross, who immediately throws the charges out, dismisses them altogether, everything. And by now, Wisconsin had included its flee warrant, fugitive flee warrant.
Okay.
And a New York lawyer looked at it for about 3 minutes and said, "This is absolute nonsense. None of the things that are required for a federal flee warrant are present in this material." Lee walked out of the courtroom a free man, and they arrested him. New York detectives arrested him on the steps of that courtroom and took him back to the Brooklyn House of Detention, where they kept him in New York with no warrant, no Miranda rights, no nothing, for, from the 19th of November, when this case was heard by Judge Ross, Magistrate Ross, to December 13th, when they returned him to Wisconsin. Lee had signed a 2-week extradition saying, yeah, take me back to Wisconsin. He wanted to face us and get it over with. They did not meet the dates. In other words, he signed that like on the 20th, and they did not get him home within 15 days. So New York then becomes involved because they extradited someone without any extradition papers that were legitimate. They, again, put him in chains. This is a guy, oh, my God, he hasn't done anything. And why are they putting him in chains? For what? Nobody's filed anything. There are no criminal charges against him. The judge has just thrown all this stuff out. There's no legal extradition. He hasn't been read his right. Nothing. This is American justice, my dear.
Wow.
And so he gets taken to Madison, Wisconsin, and is charged with not having paid, and this is 1993 now, bear in mind, December of 93, and he is supposedly not paid a $14,000 income tax, estimated civil income tax assessment. Nobody has proven that he owes that money. This is a Department of Revenue person who's filed all this. Doesn't really have the right to file it. But the interesting thing is, Lee paid the $14,129, and I've got the copies of the canceled checks twice in May and June of 1992. So 18 months before all this happened, he had paid a tax he really didn't owe. Twice.
Man, that's amazing.
Well, the interesting thing, Tim, when that happened, the guy who signed these tax warrants, which should have been, again, it goes back to it's still the same old tax warrants, Falls Vending Service. Only instead of putting the tax warrants in the names of Falls Vending, they put them in the name of Leo E. Wanta.
Ah.
Now, how did they do that? I don't know, because Lee had nothing to do with Falls Vending Service other than he was, helping the bankruptcy court, and he had served as president of the company during the sting operation that he was involved with in the 1980s, 10 years earlier. So the whole thing is absolutely crazy. I mean, this is obviously a case of selective prosecution.
Yeah.
When they finally drug him into court, he did not go to trial for this, and they kept him in prison the entire time until May of 1995. Now, bear in mind, he's returned to Wisconsin in December of 1993. So they kept him in prison that entire time, and finally the charges are filed in April of 1995, 1 month before his trial. And the trial, I go through the transcripts of that trial and just tear them apart in this book. They are the most ridiculous things you've ever heard in your life.
So essentially, they've been setting Leo up, and they've been after him. Now, here's a guy that was part of derailing the Soviet Union, and in the end, the money comes back. $27 trillion is owed to Lee, correct? It's owed to Lee.
27.5, that's right.
Yes. And he comes back, and rather than get the money, the money powers that be are haggling over this. And now, what is it, SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, says he's actually due $4.5 trillion that they are supposed to pay him? How much was it?
No, he agreed to accept $4.5 trillion, and it is an agreement that was signed by the President of the United States.
But it hasn't been paid to him yet, right?
Which has not been paid to him.
So we basically got
wait, because you got to go back to understand the reason they had to keep him chained to make sure he wouldn't go anywhere.
Marilyn, hold that, because we're out of time. So can we have you? Yeah, I know. Can we have you back on another show to pick up where we left off?
At some point, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, very good, folks. That's the broadcast for tonight. Stay tuned for Popeye and Down the Rabbit Hole, JFK, coming up.